I have a long history with Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door. Not only is it my favorite game of all time, but it is also a game that I love so much that I bought a Nintendo Switch solely to be able to play the remake when it was announced. Of course, playing TTYD as much as I have means that the base game is going to be, well, child's play. Fortunately, this is largely remedied by knowing how to make your own challenge runs for the game, where you set your own limitations and try to play with them. But there are also modifications like Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door Encore, which aim to make difficulty adjustments to make the game more interesting for veterans. Now, a disclaimer, I don't typically play mods very often. You know what they say, variety is the spice of life, and lately I've been getting into other games like Kingdom Hearts. Nonetheless, I was curious about how this mod would actually handle itself, so I figured I'd give it a playthrough. And in this video, I want to cover my overall thoughts on the mod, the things I like, the things I don't like, and whether I'd recommend it for other people to play. Encore does quite a few things that I really like, but at the top of that list have to be the fact that there are new enemy formations for each area. You're given a wider variety of enemies to fight throughout the game, with less enemies that feel like they exist only to serve as a tutorial for you. The bald clefts in Route to Shuang Fortress, for example, are completely gone, replaced with the clefts that you'll encounter in Chapter 2. Meanwhile, bristles not only exist in Shuang Fortress and in Chapter 3's Glitzvale, but they can also be encountered in Hooktail Castle, and are rebalanced to be more manageable for Koops while also having higher attack power, making them feel much more like regular enemies that you'd encounter like any other. It's a really nice change, making the game's overworld feel much more alive as you're traveling through point A to point B. A lot of enemies throughout Encore also have different properties both offensively and defensively, making them more challenging to fight. X-Dots may actually be able to make you sweat now, both because of better moves and buff stats, in addition to Encore being generally fairly stingy as far as methods to increase attack power. Badges like the Power Pluses, P-Up D-Downs, and the Rush badges are available exceptionally late. Heck, I've beaten the mod, and I don't know where to find Jumpman or Hammerman if those badges exist. Which on one hand can make battling feel a little slow, but on the other hand, it also means that enemies actually have a chance to do something against you. But we'll go much more into detail on that later. Even without the obviously really powerful badges at your disposal until much later in the game, regular enemies and boss fights I still found were fairly manageable thanks to still having plenty of variety as far as items are concerned and the statuses they afford. Mushrooms and super mushrooms, for example, now heal 10 HP and 20 HP respectively, though my favorite healing items have to be the slow shroom and gradual syrups. They're incredible items while your stats are still low, and they make fighting bosses much more manageable, which is greatly appreciated because bosses can be downright ridiculous in this mod, and I challenged myself to play under superstar restrictions, so no life shrooms and no super guards. Other statuses like allergic and poison also become available to fight with later in the game, and with a deft hand, they can be fantastic against certain bosses. And I really love that, because for as deep as TTYD's battle system is, there's quite a few more niche strategies that are only possible in Encore because of the new options you're given, for better or for worse. A fair warning, after this point in the video, I become more critical of the mod. So if what I said so far interests you, then go ahead and you can check out the mod yourself. It'll be linked in the description down below. For the rest of you, however, well, let's continue with the review. Now, I understand that modding the Thousand Year Door on Switch is somewhat in its infancy as far as what you can actually do to it. Given that, my expectations weren't all that high as far as what Tristify would be able to do with the mod. To give some examples, badge stacking with the new badges doesn't work. It increases the FP cost and that's really it. So if you manage to find duplicate copies of badges like Refresh, Poison Pound, or Blast Smash, those extra copies are good for nothing except for extra coins. Which is unfortunate, but I understand that there's only so much you can do with the tools you have available to you. That being said, it makes me question why it even is possible to get duplicates of some of these badges. A number of unstackable badges can be found in multiple different locations, generally while exploring the world and then the lovely House of Badges. Like, if only one copy of the badge will ever actually work, then limit how many copies you can find to only a single one. And if the current modding tools don't allow that, modifying the text is still clearly possible. You can just have a warning under the badge that says that it does not work with multiple copies. Though that information really isn't quite as underwhelming as all of the early game badges you have access to. And this, to me at least, is a really big sticking point. Early TTYD Encore can feel like a bit of a slog. A lot of the earliest badges you have access to really aren't very good, and really, beyond Hotfoot Hop, most early game badges really aren't worth it in battle. which on its own isn't really that big of a problem since for regular enemies, it isn't like you need a lot to win those fights anyway. But it goes beyond that. If you're like me and you prefer to play TTYD without super guarding, both your HP and FP can be exhausted fairly quickly. And it makes the lack of Heart and Flower Finder very noticeable very quickly, since neither of those badges are available until midway through the game. And it doesn't really make the mod meaningfully any harder, because if you really needed to heal HP or FP, you still have access to Sweet Treat, which, yes, was nerfed to give you only a max of 5 HP both for Mario and his partner in addition to 5 FP, but the option still exists if you really were desperate. And having early access to the finders did a lot of heavy lifting to remove busy work. Inversely, boss battles are definitely a step up in difficulty, but for the most part, this is not in a good way. In fact, I'd go as far to say that the boss battles were probably my least favorite part of the mod. For the most part, they just boil down to giving bosses an exorbitant amount of HP and attack, and it makes the pace of battle extremely sluggish. It is not fun. And if the bosses aren't beat the heck and back with extremely high attack power, there are other bosses that will just deny you your basic defensive actions, like standard guards. Which, in my opinion, I already hated this mechanic in vanilla TTYD when bosses like Marilyn can bypass your guards. So you can imagine I was none too happy to see this return in Encore, and to an even more egregious extent. Because at least in vanilla TTYD, I can't think of a time where not being able to guard an attack also meant that I would be forced to eat a status ailment. That seems like the kind of thing you really should be warned about at the bare minimum. And sometimes when you tattle, Goombella will warn you, other times she won't. And like, I grew up playing games like Crash Bandicoot, I'm no stranger to trial and error. But when the player is given a tool that allows them to learn information by asking for it, there is an expectation that the player is actually warned in advance what they need to actually know. Not providing that information when specifically asked for feels cheap. This is especially prominent when it comes to battling Dupless in Chapter 4. Not only can you not guard any of your partners, but at least when I played Encore, Goombella had an attack power of 4, and her multi-bonk was still capable of hitting a whopping 6 times, despite the fact that as the player, you're limited to only 3 bounces, which in my opinion is absolutely garbage game design. I could see the argument of it being fair if the player had access to those tools as well, but the player doesn't. Not to this extent anyway. Dupless can also bypass your guards when using his hammer because he has Blast Smash, and explosions in this mod do bypass your defenses, which fortunately is something you're warned about much earlier thanks to Goombella tattling Bob-Ombs. But it all the same adds up to how overwhelming this boss fight can be when you don't have access to one of your basic options for defending yourself. And without something as basic as minor counterplay like being able to protect yourself, it turns this boss fight into one of luck. And it's especially screwed up because in Chapter 4, you're unable to return the Rogue Port to really properly prepare if you don't have the right badges or items. Here especially just left a really sour taste in my mouth. And if I wasn't such a diehard tryhard of this game, I'd probably quit playing the mod right here and now. For that matter, while I understand how the SP nerf can actually impact how bosses play out, I feel like in the long run, it does a lot more harm than good. Because not only was SP regen nerfed, but several of Mario's special moves are just made less potent in general. Some nerfs I appreciate, like Power Lift only being able to give a max of +2 in both attack and defense now as opposed to +4, but other moves like Sweet Treat and Showstopper I feel like were nerfed to an excessive degree. The former is now effectively useless unless you wanted to play scummy and just repeatedly grind SP and regular enemies to build up your stats, while the latter is just way too unreliable to bother with. Showstopper just being semi-reliable was really its only saving grace, and without that it just kinda sucks. It's clear you're now intended to just use Sweet Feast for bosses now, which costs 1 less SP than it did in vanilla, and no longer drops poison mushrooms, so it's a lot less risky to use. However, what I find is especially strange is that despite all the nerfs to star powers and your special moves, a lot of your offensive special moves were not really nerfed at all. Eventually, I got to a point where I just stopped trying to engage with the regular enemies I was fighting, instead resorting to using moves like Art Attack, appealing, running away, rinse and repeat until I have enough SP to do it again, and just battling that way, which was especially powerful because Simplifier no longer costs BP, and with attacking giving you almost no SP even with Stylishes being inputted, it just became preferable to play that way because it was the fastest way through. This is just what happens when your options for badges are largely subpar before Chapter 6. Worse yet, the moves that Mario gained from getting upgraded boots and hammers also now cost SP, which when you factor in how slow SP is to be regained, makes them pretty much useless in battle. I understand the logic behind this is to differentiate the moves from the badge moves like Hot Foot Hop, but I cannot fathom a practical situation where this would actually make Spin Jump preferable, because if you wanted to use Spin Jump more than you had units of star power to exhaust, you're certainly going to have to appeal, which would mean you'd be losing on damage from your partner. Even your upgraded hammer moves also cost SP. And while the hammer is generally stronger in this mod, you're really only going to benefit from using those moves if you use them in first strikes. Otherwise, for the most part, I found myself just leaving these moves in the dust. Not even Dazzle's badges are really all that good, which is especially jarring because you can't even buy badges from him anymore. The way his badges work now are that you have to collect all the star pieces within a single chapter, and then in your art gallery you're given a clue to find whatever badge was hidden by Dazzle in that chapter. A very cool concept, but the rewards are largely very underwhelming, which, considering how much effort you actually need to collect all of the star pieces, I really have to question what the mod creator was thinking by making the rewards badges like HP Drain and Defend Plus. I remember first finding out about this system and thinking, oh okay, this is how I'm going to find badges like Quick Change, just to then not find it until Chapter 8's Palace of Shadow. Disappointing to be sure, but hey, at least it's available before you beat the game. Other badges weren't quite so lucky. But yeah, I didn't mean to go on for so long about my issues with the mod. It's just a lot easier to be negative than positive, you know? There are other things I could mention, like partner balance being downright whack, with Miss Mouse having an attack that hits all enemies on the screen for the same FP cost as Koops' Power Shell, and being able to lower defense. Or how a lot of bosses have HP triggers that are largely unaffected by the higher HP, which if you know how phase shifts work in this game, it makes them barely any harder. But this mod is still in development. And I don't want to be too hostile because, like I said before in this video, modding of the Switch version of TTYD is still in its infancy. So there's only so much that Tristify can actually do. As far as whether I'd recommend playing this mod, I would only say yes if you're willing to put up with some of the more jank game design choices in it. As while there are a few things I like about this mod, there are a lot of things that I don't like about it. And those things that I don't like make it difficult for me to recommend it. And I'm sorry if what I said hurt to hear, but I just want to be honest with y'all. And that's the truth.